In this video, I'm going to talk about one of the most common watercolour mistakes, and that's using the wrong type of brush. Welcome back to my channel. If we haven't met before, my name is Michelle. On this channel you'll find art techniques and art business advice, so please consider subscribing. If you press the bell notification, then you'll get notified every time I upload a new video. So the first mistake that I see beginners making is using brushes that are too small. So I've got some brushes here to show you, and I'm going to hold them up, see if the camera will pick them up. Now this is the sort of brush that I see beginners using all the time. It's far too little, and this is the sort of brush that they should be using. Now when I ask them to use a larger brush, often there's a bit of resistance, and I think what it is that when you're a beginner, you think that if you use a little brush, you'll get more accuracy, and although it's kind of true, it's not going to help you at all with watercolour painting, because the smaller the brush you use, the worse results you're going to get. You always want to be using as large a brush as you can. Now, it's not true that with a big brush you can't get any accuracy. So this brush here, it's a fairly old one, but it's still got quite a point on. It's a big brush, but I can get an amazing amount of accuracy with this brush, and I'll drop one or two pictures in as I'm talking of some of my own paintings so that you can see the accuracy I get just with a couple of brushes really. So that would be this one, which would be a size 10, and this one, which I think is a size 6. So you can see, you know, I've got some accuracy with the smaller one, but they're not really tiny. So what's the advantage to using a larger brush? Well, a larger brush will hold more water and it will hold more paint, and quite simply you won't have to keep lifting it off the paper as much. Now the main enemy of the beginner is uneven drying. Now uneven drying happens when you take too long to apply your paint, and you have to keep dipping in and out of the water jar and of the paint palette. So if you use a bigger brush, it just holds a lot of paint. You can sweep it along and you can get that nice, even, more importantly, fast application, and your paint will dry evenly, and then you won't be getting those tons and tons of tiny drying lines. So as I'm speaking, I'm going to drop some footage in of me painting a couple of leaves, and I'm going to show you the difference between painting a leaf with a large brush, where I can just sweep around in one stroke more or less, you know, around the edges, fill in the middle, and we're done, and leave it alone, and it dries nice and flat. And then look at the difference when I'm using a small brush and I have to keep applying paint. It's drying, I haven't got time, it takes ages and ages, and I'm going to end up with lots and lots of drying lines. Beginners often have this happen in skies as well, often get drying lines in skies, and the reason is the brush is too small and they're taking too long over applying the paint. So on to mistake number 2, and mistake number 2, which I see quite regularly amongst beginners, is to use small flat brushes. So I'm going to hold a couple up here, and we've got this one. This one is a square-ended brush, and this one is a round-ended brush. They call this a filbert, but as you can see, if I turn it around in the camera, it's actually a flat brush. Now, some flat brushes can be really useful for watercolour painting. You might want some large ones like this. They're really useful for putting paint on and putting water on, but you shouldn't be doing all your painting with a small flat brush. Now at this point I want to explain the difference between accuracy and tightness. So they talk about tight painting, where they mean that you can do, you know, tiny precise little details, but what I'm talking about is accuracy, and accuracy is necessary for any type of painting. Even if you paint quite loosely and you paint in an abstract manner, you still need to be able to place the marks where you want them and how you want them on the paper. Now, if you're a beginner, what you're going to find is that your level of accuracy of just wielding a paintbrush is going to be quite low, and you're going to need to practice that. Now, whilst you're practicing, it's not going to be helping you if you're using brushes like these, and the reason for that is they make large marks, you know, and this one particularly, this round one, you know, they make very indistinct marks. The square edge one, you know, as you would expect, makes square edged marks. So it's not going to help you to do precise I'd say drawing. I'm talking about painting, but you're still, you know, to me painting is just drawing with a brush. So if you're a beginner, I want you to leave those sort of brushes alone. If you're a more experienced painter and you have found a way of working that incorporates small flat brushes, you know, I am not the brush police. If it works for you, then use it. But if you're a beginner, I want you to start out by using traditional watercolour brushes. So at this point I'm going to recommend a few brands to you, and I'll also drop those in the description below. If you click the little downwards button, you can find links to these brushes as well. So the first set of brushes I'm going to recommend to you, or the first brand I'm going to recommend to you, would be De Laroni Graduates. These have got white handles, and they're unusual because every single, as far as I can tell, every brush in the range is the same price, and they're a really good price too. So if you want a budget, these are the ones to choose. Now, they don't last quite as well as some of the more expensive brushes, but you know, you get what you pay for, and they're perfectly good enough to begin with. So in fact, you can use any range of well-known student quality synthetic watercolour brushes, and they'll start you off in the right place. However, the next brand I'm going to recommend to you is Winsor & Newton Cotman. Cotman is their students range, and those brushes are very nice too. Lastly, I'd like to recommend the brushes that I use myself, and that would be SAA Silver brushes. They are a British brand, but you can get them on Amazon wherever you live. So moving on to mistake number 3, and that would just be a brush that is really floppy and scruffy and possibly bent. So I don't even keep brushes like that in the studio, but I have got one here where the you know, the point's completely gone, it's completely had it. If you find that your brushes are constantly in that shape, it is simply because you are standing them in the water jars. Now, this is something that I am really, really strict at in my art classes. In fact, I have worked my students into such a state of paranoia that as I walk through the door, if there's somebody new there and they're standing their brush in the water, the person next to them goes, "What, she's coming, stop it." So you really shouldn't be standing your brushes in the water for any reason when you're watercolour painting. There's a slight excuse for doing it with acrylics when the paint can dry as plastic on the brush, so you have to keep your brushes wet. But there's no excuse for doing it with watercolours. Put some newspaper down and lay your brushes flat on the table. And once they get to the point where they have no point on them whatsoever, do keep them, because old brushes are always useful for all sorts of things, including gluing stuff and you know, scrubbing at dried paint and anything at all. Do keep those brushes, but you don't want to be using them for your painting. Now, the last thing about that I will say is floppy brushes. If your brush is so sort of floppy that when you press it on the paper, it just kind of collapses, a brush should have some spring, so that's not a good sign either. So brushes that are fluffy, brushes that are bent or scruffy or very floppy when you press them against the paper, you don't need to be using those for watercolour painting, just keep them for old stuff. Finally, let's look at mistake number 4, and that's using acrylic brushes instead of watercolour brushes. And this one is a tricky one because I'm afraid to say that some of the rather cheaper stationery shops that you get are selling these type of brushes labelled watercolour brushes. Now, you can normally tell, this is not an absolute rule, but you can usually tell that a brush is for acrylics because the bristles are white and not brown. Again, not an exact rule, but it's a hint. I'm going to show you a couple of acrylic brushes here. You can see they're much stiffer and they've got white bristles, at least they were white before I covered them in paint. They can be really useful for watercolour painting, for all sorts of things actually. You know, if you need to scrub out paint, you know, if you're doing some kind of technique where you don't want to ruin your best watercolour brushes, they can be useful things. So don't throw them away, but you really shouldn't be doing the main body of your painting with them. So as I said at the beginning of the video, what you want to be using to start with are brushes like these and possibly some large flat brushes. I will do a more in-depth video on all the different types of brushes and what they're used for. But to start with, you know, if you only have one brush at all, make sure it's something like this. This is called a round brush, and it's not round because the end is round, so it's a bit confusing for beginners. The end actually has a point, but the ferrule, the bit that's the metal bit, is round, and that's why they call it a round brush. It holds lots of paint, and that's the brush you want to start using when you're starting watercolours. Do have a look at the description section of this video where I have linked to an article on my website that will explain everything I've talked about in this video just in a little bit more depth, so you can get the best out of your paintbrushes as a beginner. And if you're ready to take your creativity to the next level, please do consider subscribing, and if you ring the bell notification, you won't miss anything, and I'll see you again in my studio soon.